anyway, I don't really want this to be like a lecture style thing. I'd rather it to be more of a conversation. Because if you've been to church recently, we've been doing a series on wisdom, and the little tagline for it is the art of navigating life. And parenting, like so many other aspects, like marriage, like work, they're all parts of wisdom. And so parenting, just like the bigger category, is really an art. It's an art form. And so it's not a question of, I need to give you information, and then you go apply the information, and voila, perfect children. That's not quite how parenting works. And for those who have kids that are over the age of about 2 days, realize that that's the case. And so so it really is an art form. So I was hoping tonight, present a few things, but then really have a conversation about where you all are in your journey as parents, and sort of bend it into, I guess, what's most helpful for you. And so I thought to begin with, let's just start with some introduction so we all get to know who's who. So if you can, we'll start just, give your name and then kind of where you are in your parenting career. So
Career.
It is a career. It's a career that actually doesn't end, but that's a different story. Yeah.
Quite the opposite.
Yeah, that's right.
No pay either.
No. Actually, there is, and we'll talk about that. But anyway, I'm Dennis. I'm one of the pastors here. I am a father of 3. I have my oldest daughter, Elizabeth, is 32.
Will be 32.
Will be 32.
In November.
My middle, yeah, I know.
Oh, she used to babysit me.
Yeah. Now you're feeling. Now you're feeling what I. Yes. So my oldest daughter is 32. My son, our number 2 child, is going to be 30.
Will be 30 in November. Yeah.
And then my youngest is 28. So we are parents of 3 adult children. So we're really here tonight to share all of our mistakes. So don't do this, right?
Yeah.
So anyway.
Yeah. What do I have to add
You
to
can
that?
just give your name.
Oh, my name's Ina. Tina without the T. It's an easy way to remember. So next June, we'll be celebrating our 40th anniversary. Wow, that's hard to believe. Yeah.
It's a long road.
So, yeah.
My dad would say it's a lifetime sentence, but anyway.
So
She wasn't laughing. I wasn't looking.
I mean, you all know it's not easy, right? It's hard.
Although of the 2, parenting is much harder. Much harder than marriage.
For us, I guess. Not for everybody.
Yeah, not for everybody.
Yeah, other people, just different struggles, different situations. So anyway, I'm not sure what else to add to it.
No, that's fine.
They're also your kids.
They are.
Oh, they're also. Good
That's
point.
Right. Do the math. That's a good thing.
Good point. Yeah.
So.
Well, hello. I'm Marissa. I have 2 kids, 2 and under. So.
2 kids, 2 and under. Wow.
Yeah. Jonah will be 3 in October, and
Okay.
Hudson just turned 1.
Okay.
So
Wow.
2 boys. Very outnumbered. Yeah.
Yeah.
I am Jill, and I have 2 kids. I have a son, Jack, who's 9, and a daughter, Lily, who's 7. And my husband is Dan. He's not here, but we've been married for almost 11 years.
Yeah.
You're in the odd years.
Yeah, odd years.
The odd years.
Yeah.
They are a little odd.
No.
Yeah.
Susie and Bill, we're parents of 3 kids. Sophia is 13, Sarah is 11, Max who's 8. Elizabeth was our babysitter, like back when Sophia was like 3 or something like that.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, didn't she teach Sophia piano or something?
Yeah, and when she basically just
Yeah.
play with
A long time ago.
Yeah.
Right, and we've been married for almost 20 years. We're coming up on 20.
Wow.
Yeah. His wife.
All right, my name is Chad. I have 2 kids, 9 and 6, William and Taylor. So he's a handful. And so I can't wait till I get to your point. But then the outside of that is, you know, everything else. But
Yeah.
we've been blessed. So, you know, Lisa, who's my wife, she's not here. She's working right now at MSK down the street here. So she couldn't be here. We've been married for 11 years, 12 years, 11 years. So yeah, she made it easy for me because we got engaged on 10/10/10,
Okay.
and then we got
Yeah.
married on 11/11/11, which is 11 years ago.
Alright.
Right? If you do
Yeah.
the math.
Oh,
So, you
wow.
know,
Nice.
so we were hoping to have one of them on 12/12/12. It didn't work out.
That's a little bit harder to do.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
so we, you know, I mean, so this is our first time here, and you know, it's so far we had Pastor Chris was
Yeah.
teaching yesterday, so he was so he taught a very good lesson, and you know, so I said, let me come back, you know, got some other treasures here, so
Yeah.
you know, so we've been looking for a church, so we went a couple places already, and you know, Lisa's not feeling it, so she said, you know, when she's not working, she'll come and you know, see how it is.
Yeah.
Oh,
See
good.
if it's a good fit.
Yeah.
Well, welcome.
Yeah.
Good to
So
have
far, she liked it. She was here yesterday. She said she had good feelings about it, and she liked the program.
you. Oh, good.
Nice.
Very good. All right, well, we pretty much have broad spectrum of parenting represented
From
here.
1 to
2 under 2,
1
up
to
to
13.
early teens to adult children. So yeah, so that's good. We'll have a lot of different input into the different stages. But what would you say right now, as you just think about it, what comes to mind when you think, what is the hardest part right now of parenting for you? What's the most challenging piece that you're facing?
Finding good help.
Good help to do?
You know, like when I'm at work. I mean, I got my in-laws, but
You mean for like childcare?
yeah,
Okay. Okay.
because they're great. You know, as far as feeding them and that sort of stuff. But you know, I'm like, oh, you got to keep them engaged so they don't run over you. So,
Keep them occupied.
yeah, so
Yeah.
they're like, they get run over by them all the time.
What about for you and your wife personally in raising your kids? What would you say is like the hardest challenge?
I don't think Lisa can handle the energy. You know, they're both high energy.
Yeah.
You know, so she
Yeah.
she tries to do it, but you know, sometimes she's like, you know, this is it's kind of crazy with her
Yeah.
because she comes home tired. Like
Right.
she has them all morning, then she goes to work, and then when in the evening time, I try to wear them out and do stuff with them, but they still going. You know?
Yeah.
And she's like, oh man, I need to get to bed.
Yeah.
Very good.
I think for me, it's trying to say something and they limit like the communication because there's Sophia who's a teenager and Max who's still little. And
How old is Max?
Max is 8.
8, okay.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So I think he listens more now than anybody else, and it goes by age. Max listens the best, then Sarah, and then Sophia. You have to be very like short sentence, just not to take it the wrong way because since he's a teenager,
Yeah.
you know, it's like stepping in eggs.
Yeah, it is interesting, right, to go from 8 to 13, even though it's not that big of a gap, the difference.
It's
And
huge.
yeah, it's
We didn't have Sarah in the middle. I mean, the two of them.
there's no buffer. Yeah, someone to relay information across. Yeah, it's that is one of the challenges. You know, and that's when I talked about it being parenting being more of an art form than it is, you know, this idea of getting it right sort of thing. That's part of it. Not only does the age matter, the kids change over time, but their gender makes a difference, their personality makes a difference, birth order makes a difference, home situation makes a difference. So you've got, I'm assuming both of you work, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so you have 2 parents working, that's different than, you know, a home where it's not. There are so many variables that to be able to say, okay, here are the rules, do this, and it'll be a success. No. And just when you get it down, the other one comes along. It's like, okay, none of that worked.
What worked for the first one doesn't work for the second.
It just goes off the rails and you start over again. Good. Anyone else want to share?
I would say that probably like today's world is really scary. I have 2 kids in public school, and I do like the public school that they go to. It's more conservative, but they just like you want to protect them, and you don't want them to know everything, but at the same time they have to know some things. And my son is like really good at asking hard questions,
Mhm.
like so good at it. And
Too good at it.
I'm like horrible at answering them usually. So, and they always catch me off guard. And so yesterday was actually really good. But yeah, like 4th grade, he's kind of like starting to wonder about stuff and ask me things and realize what's kind of going around
Mhm.
the world. And I just, it's hard. It's
Yeah.
scary.
It's hard, it's scary,
You keep
and,
them in a bubble, but you don't
Mhm.
want it.
right,
at the
we'll
same
talk a
time.
little bit about that bubble and kind of, what that means when it bursts, so.
Trying to make sure that like my daughter doesn't like necessarily weasel her way into some of the conversations I have with him because then
She's not ready
like,
for
she's
it.
definitely not ready for it. Like you said, they're so different. Like
That is quite a challenge. Yeah.
I feel like for me right now, it's really about like I don't know how to like describe emotions to my toddler.
Mm.
Like it's obviously I think like a lot of his just outbursts, if you will, like just a lot of the way he expresses himself. Like it's hard for me to navigate like you said, kind of like this is what's right, this is what you should do, but in a way that his like 2-year-old brain can comprehend. So we're not always like in this like essentially screaming match.
Right.
Because like how can I tell my son to not scream at his brother by screaming at him because he's screaming so loud he can't hear me?
scream.
Like it just doesn't feel like anything productive is happening.
We're all
just yelling and nobody's happy. We're all crying at the end of it. And so I think like just trying to figure out how to like teach him how to just like tell me what you're thinking, what you're feeling, and we can like go from there. I'm in that phase where, and he's a very bright kid. Like he just knows more things than I expected a 2-year-old to know. So yeah, I'm like, well, okay, I guess corrects me on all the trucks and trains.
The important stuff,
Yeah,
anyway.
and he's so observant that sometimes I think that he obviously is like reflecting maybe some of my sinful nature, and that's always super hard too, like to watch your 2-year-old
Mimicking
be
those
like a
things.
mirror of your most terrible qualities.
Yep.
For some reason, that catches on
That like
more
keeps
quickly.
happening.
Yeah,
It's
and they
just-
both, I mean, Hudson's only one, but still I can see like a totally different personality in him and just how they interact, and it just, I'm at a loss.
Yeah. So when you started talking about, all the screaming back and forth, I had this mental picture of, in the context of this is art, wisdom is art, parenting is art. Just picture a canvas and you're all like throwing paint on it.
Honestly, that's what it feels like.
But then when you step back, I think God's going to make
Looks
it,
great.
God is able
make
to
it a
make
beautiful
something
picture.
out of
a
it.
little Jackson Pollock light, but it's okay.
Very good. So, Jim, we were just asking kind of what do you, at this stage where you are with your family, what do you find to be the most difficult or challenging piece right now for you? So I don't know if you have anything off the top, but.
It's just a lot of chaos, really.
It's just the
So
chaos.
trying to manage all the chaos.
The word for the chaos
I
would be fun.
definitely, can maybe what you said with the, I try to get them to behave by yelling at them, right? And that obviously, and then then Harrison's yelling at his brother and being mean to him. I'm like, and then I scream at him for screaming at his brother, and I realize he's doing exactly what I do, So haven't really mastered that yet. That hardcore mode of reacting, purposefully in ways to situations. It's most of the time just reacting emotionally to things and out of anger and frustration.
Right.
For me, my hardest thing is just consistency with parenting, because a lot of times just depends on my mood,
Right.
my frustration level, something's going on at work or whatever it may be. But in my household, Alice and I have a decent balance of we're not similar at all in our personalities, which I think it works well in a parenting model because we can balance each other out.
Yeah.
So she's definitely stricter and more disciplined and putting the rules down
And enforcing them.
I'm just trying not to mess all that up. But I'm doing a really good job messing it up.
Just like Dan, probably.
Yeah.
It does feel like
Comes
that.
home
I
and
know.
just like
Dad,
Right.
man.
All that work all day is not gone. You walk in the door.
Yeah, pretty much.
I say the same thing he does, but somehow convincing power, you know. I just say like 10 times, nothing happens, right? He say, oh, okay.
Yeah.
The enforcer.
It's like, no one in my family
But I'm
would
the
do that.
mediator, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bill, did you have anything that you'd like to say as far as what's most
I would
challenging for you?
incriminate one of my daughters if I spoke to her. You know, Sophia being 13, she's
Very
everything
challenging.
that a 13-year-old girl, like the stereotype.
But
Mm.
some days she's our old Sophia. She wakes up and she's so happy and the world is fine, and then she reads the paper and then it's all awful place.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, part of that is just the changes going on, right?
Mm.
Yeah. All right, so that's kind of where you all are now. The next question I wanted to ask, just to keep the conversation going, is, you know, as we mentioned when we started, that all of our kids are adults. They're 30 plus or minus a couple of years, right? And so we can relate really well to where each of you are and the challenges, because there's nothing really unique in what you're saying. It comes with the territory, so to speak. But as you think about where do you want to be, say 20 years from now? Where do you want your family to be? What do you want it to look like in 20 years?
I want to talk to them every day.
Mm.
Good communication. Yeah, that's good.
Honestly, I've never thought of that, because the thing I think about all the time, maybe it's just being an older dad, is like, I know these years are slipping away and they're just amazing, and I don't want them to.
Yeah, well, hold on, right?
Despite all the aggravation and everything else, it's just like, I realize these are like the greatest times. And,
Mm.
you know, I see my parents, they have a great marriage. My dad just turned 90 just now, but you know, they're like, there they are sitting in their little place, and I'm like, oh my God.
We've seen the future.
All the noise, I mean, that's what brings like a home to life, right? All the aggravation in a way.
It's like the stuff you complain about the most, is all the stuff you're gonna miss the most.
Yeah, you always say
And
that.
it's so hard to like remember.
Mm.
Yeah,
It is. But the reality is that's what's coming, and it goes like that,
Yeah.
right? You know, we were just saying, like, my daughter taught her daughter, or babysat for her
Babysat, yeah.
daughter when she was a newborn, and now she's living up in Clifton. She's got a career. It goes very, very quickly. And so, anyone else want to share on that? When you look ahead, whatever it is, 20 years down the road, what do you want for your family? What do you want it to look like?
I think, you know, the biggest thing is that I want both of them to be respectful
Mm.
and for them to be like the greatest resource for each other. Because like Bill is saying, it's like the time is moving so fast. I look at my 87-year-old mother and I'm like, you know, even though we want to see them grow up, we're gonna be growing at the same time.
Mhm.
So, you know, we're not gonna always be there for them, but, you know, at least if they're respectful to people around them and respectful to each other and they grow up together close, at least, you know, that'll take them through,
Yeah.
in my estimation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good.
I agree with that, because it's really hard to imagine that, like, my kids fight, like, all they do is fight. And like, so if they could just, like, grow up and be really close,
Mhm.
and they could kind of stay kind of close to home, and I can see them a lot, and I can like their
Mhm.
significant others, you know.
Yeah.
I'm
A lot
trying
of
to be like the
questions.
annoying mother-in-law, but like, I
There
just
are.
like want them to be with me and like each other.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think like all of those sentiments
Mhm.
are, I think like for me, and I think about at least just my two kids now, like I want them to be independent, like, you know, take care of themselves, but I also want them to recognize their, like, the need for community. Like I don't want them to be isolated.
Right.
I want them to, or to look back and feel like Rob and I provided a community for them that could, you know, come alongside them and just like, because like everyone said, you know, like we're their parents, so we are not always going to be here, but Lord willing, they'll always have each other.
Right.
And just like, I want them to know that like we tried our best to give them
Right.
that, or like just paved the way a little bit for them to be able to, you know, especially I think because I have two boys, it's always like, I want them to be like men, but I don't want them to be like calloused. I
Mm.
want them to have friends and deep relationships with people who will just encourage them and be there with them. So.
Mm-hmm. Good. Anyone else have thoughts on that?
I mean, part of the reason why I wanted several kids, I guess, was to be able to maybe foster that, relation, the dependence on each other as they grow. Like, as my gift to them is that no matter what happens, they could always have each other, right?
Yeah.
I know this world would be a tough place, right? And, so especially if you're going out alone. So, I love the idea of a big family, and we don't have a lot of, a huge extended family as far as cousins and stuff like that are concerned. So my hope is that they will stay close, be able to depend on each other. I see my girls are very close right now. My mother is close with her sister still. So you see that relationship.
Yeah.
So my prayer is that they will remain close and be able to depend on each other through the hard times, in life, and the boys as well, obviously.
Mhm.
And I guess in 20 years, my prayer would be that they just find something, direction in their life that brings them, contentment and joy. And peace, honestly, and obviously we're trying to lead them to Christ, right? So you can always find your peace and contentment there,
Right.
But in this world of a lot of pressures and trying to figure out your way and what you should do, what you should be, right? My prayer that they just find something that really brings their heart joy,
Yeah, no, good. Good. So there's two things you said in there before I try to tie in the rest of the pieces. Was one, it's your prayer, and two, to lead them to Christ. I think that's something we really need to process as parents, because if you're looking at some of the other things that have been talked about tonight, which really I would sum up in relationships. As you look ahead 20 years or when they're adults, the hope is that there are good relationships, healthy relationships with you as a parent and with each other as siblings, right? And if Christ is in the center of their lives, then that's a big step toward it. And so with that kind of thought in mind, it's more of a rhetorical question just to kind of take it to the next step. So you talked about what your biggest struggles are, so the now piece. Like what is it now that you're really wrestling with? And you look 20 years down the road, what you hope things are going to be, how it'll turn out for your family. The question is, well, how do you go from here to here? Right? How do you go from where you are to where you want to be in terms of leading your family, or in terms for the title of tonight's thing, the parental priorities? What sort of priorities should you have now that will point you most accurately toward what you see as sort of the goal of parenting? And so again, that's more of a rhetorical question, because I think that puts the two pieces in place. In order for you to know or to establish what your priorities are now, you need to really understand where you are and where you're going. Right? You need to know the mission, and you need to know where you're starting from, so you can begin to orient yourself and your family in that particular direction. Before we start, any other comments or questions about goals, about where you want to take your family, what particular struggles or anything like that? Do you have any thoughts you'd like to add?
I'm cold, so I'm going to get my jacket.
I'm up here dying. I go and turn. This is an issue in marriage. I don't know if anyone else has that issue. Yeah.
So the way we solve that problem in bed is I have an electric blanket, I fold it in half and
Yeah,
put
you were
underneath
Under
the
the
fitted
Fitted
sheet.
sweating.
So I heat it up from my side, and
This is exactly what happens.
I thank the Lord for cars with the individual controls and
Yeah, Alice is up to like 9 blankets every night. I'm like, you're making me sweat. I'm looking at you. I'm like, tape those up.
We're like the opposite.
Right.
I'm always warm, and Rob's like, "Can we turn the air on?" I'm like, "No." The first summer we were married, he was like, "Please, it's so cold in here. Please turn it up." He's like shivering.
All right, so there's two texts that I wanted to just talk about this evening before we get into maybe some more practical application. Not that Scripture isn't practical, but it sort of lays the framework behind what we do. And so, as I said, when you talked about what your struggles are now, and what we talked about in terms of where you would like your family to be in the future, it's understanding the mission and understanding what season of life you are in. And so the two texts I wanted to briefly touch on tonight was very famous Psalm 127. I think it's one of the classic parenting psalms that are out there, but it's classic for a reason. because it is really good. Someone want to read verses 1 and 2? Yeah, just shout it out.
A song of ascents of Solomon. Unless the Lord builds the house, they labor in vain who build it. Unless the Lord guards the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. It is vain for you to rise up early, to sit up late, to eat the bread of sorrows, for so he gives his beloved sleep.
I don't know about you, but when I read that early on in my parenting, verse 2 was like, oh, there I am, right? Get up early, stay up late, and eat the bread of sorrows. Like, man, this is just hard work, right? But it doesn't. What this psalm is telling. It's interesting. It's by Solomon, right? Which is, he's the man who wrote Proverbs. He's God's vessel for sharing a lot of practical wisdom of life, and so it's not a surprise that he wrote this. But if you look carefully at what verse 1 says, it says, unless the Lord builds the house, they labor in vain who build it. Unless he guards, the watchman stays awake in vain. What it's not saying is, you don't have anything to do, give it to God. God will take care of all of this. It doesn't tell you to stop building or to not build. It doesn't tell you to not be a watchman or be on guard. It tells you that unless the Lord is the one that's leading you in this, unless the Lord is the one that's actually doing the work, and you're participating with him, you're going to struggle. And that's essentially what he's saying. He's saying if you're trying to build a family, which is really what this psalm is getting at, if you're in the process of building and growing a family, and God is not an integral part of it to the point where he's actually the one doing the work and leading, and that was to Jim's point earlier about getting your children to see Christ and receive Christ, if that's not the central piece, then you will struggle. You will struggle, and verse 2 will become sort of the template of your life. You'll have trouble sleeping. You'll just be consumed with anxiety and worry and really just trying to constantly figure things out. And so what he's telling us there is God needs to be the one that's actually building the house, but you build with him. So it's not that I'm going to hand them to the church or I'm going to hand them to God and then we'll just go off and do our thing, right? We are called to be participants in this with God. Any questions on that idea? Because that really is a small version of how God treats us as our Father, because he calls us to participate in our faith as well. It's not a passive thing. God is calling us to participate and to do things and to work on, he talks about working out our salvation. So in the big scheme of our faith, it's participatory. So it's no surprise that parenting and family is also participatory. God is inviting us into what he is doing in your family. And then verse 3, behold, children are a heritage from the Lord. The fruit of the womb is a reward. Now you have to remember, Psalms like Proverbs is poetry. Right? And so this is kind of a parallel thing. Behold, children and fruit of the womb. So that's a parallel thing. He's talking about children. And children are both a heritage and a reward. What's a heritage? What does that mean?
Something that's given to, like, inherited?
It has the idea of inheritance, that it's passed on. Any other thoughts on what heritage is? What's that? Google it. It's where you come from. There's a connectedness back, right? And so when God is talking here about children being a heritage, he's talking about, he's connecting you to something larger than yourself. And so it's not just you as a parent and your children, it's fitting into a bigger picture. And I think that's what God is communicating here, that children are a link into this bigger picture, this bigger thing that God is doing. Now, when we look at that, the idea of heritage, and we look at, going back to verse 1, God is building a house. What house is God building? Is he building your house? Is that what he's going out? Build your house. What house is he building?
Church.
He's building a church, right? And I think as you unwind the rest of Scripture, particularly when you go into the New Testament, that's what this salvation is all about. That's what, when we talk about leading our children to the Lord, we're leading them into a much larger family. And what are some of the characteristics of that family? Which is the family of God, the church. It's eternal. It is an eternal family. And so God's view is much, much bigger than ours. So we're all here tonight, we're talking about parenting, and this isn't a criticism, it's just a reality. You tend to be focused on right where you are, what's in front of you, where the struggles are, what your next decisions are from school, and how much exposure to the world they need to be. How do I deal with a daughter that's going into her teen years and all that's unfolding in that? You got 3 boys that never stop moving. Who else was the energy? The crazy levels of energy. The pressures force us to be narrowly focused. God is not. Well, God is all-knowing and all-powerful. So he's able to go down to the very, very nitty-gritty while not losing sight of the big picture. And so what he's calling us to in here, when he talks about a heritage, he's calling us to remember the big picture. And so when you think about, so for me, as I thought about kind of some of these questions, and I asked, where do you want to see yourself in 20 years? That's very personal for me because we're there now. We are there. Our children are all adults, and with the exception of my son, who's out back with us, they're all on their own. Although he's really on his own, he just can't afford to buy a house in Monmouth County at the moment. Which is crazy. But the thing about that is they have all put their faith in Christ. They're in different places in their faith and how it's being lived out in their lives. But I look at that, and as a dad, I still worry about kind of where are they in all of this. But I know they made a profession of faith. They're in the family of God, and so they're in the house that God is building. And so I can step back, and it relieves the pressure. Right? And so when you think about parenting priorities, there is your number one priority, is to instill in them the truth of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And when they say yes to it, the whole dynamic will change. Doesn't mean it'll suddenly get easy. You'll still face all of these challenges, but you can always step back and say, God's got this, with total confidence. So God is building a house, and he's building an eternal house, and your children are invited into that. Each one has to make their own profession of faith. You don't get in because of your parents. I mean, you're not excluded because of your parents, to work both ways. But it's what God is building. Now, the second piece, he says, the fruit of the womb, this children, is a reward. What did you do to earn this reward? Well, what is the reward? It's kind of an interesting thing, at least for me, as I thought about it. Reward. What does this say, reward? As if I got what I deserved, even as a parent. So I wouldn't call it a reward.
Well, if you're successful, I guess, in bringing them to the Lord, that's good to be with them forever.
Yeah, and we don't have to talk about what do you hope for 20 years. It's forever. Yeah. It is forever. The reward is an eternal reward. The reward is the same reward you have when you stepped into faith in Jesus Christ. You have an eternity with God and with every one of your children who have also placed their faith in God. And so it takes, as I said earlier, it takes the pressure off. And some of these things that just crush you, I could really relate to how much do you expose your children to what craziness is out there and when is the appropriate time. It can get overwhelming. But to realize God is in full control here, and I can trust him for that because he is building a house that will stand.
But is it speaking also, the fruit of the womb is a reward, so obviously eternal reward is there, but could it apply, is there an application to the children? How are they, if the fruit is our children, how are they a reward?
My thought is if we're thinking about like the idea of heritage, right? Like your children are kind of like your legacy, right? Your heritage is like kind of in your past, kind of family lineage, right? And your children are a continuation of that. And the reward of children is kind of a relational aspect where you're building this, this group of people that are going to be together
a community.
For your community, basically. Like this is our pot of people here that we're gonna be together no matter what happens, right? Thick and thin.
And then there's
Yeah.
hopefully grandchildren.
Right.
Yeah, it plugs you into, whether you talk about the eternal perspective or whether you talk about, just the human lineage perspective. It's children, and Scripture talks about that, the generations and the joy that comes from being able to see your children's children, right? That
Really, the idea of heritage is really very important, I feel like, to the human heart anyway. Like, if you have this longing to know who we are, who we came from, when you look at all that ancestry.com
Yeah,
stuff,
yeah.
like, or if somebody was adopted and they find out they're adopted, like, I have to know who my real parents
Yeah.
are, right? Because you have this desire to kind of know who you are based on, your heritage.
Yeah, I think our identity is really wrapped up in where we came from, right? Even when you talk about, adopted kids, they generally, at some point, they just have a desire to want to know, where am I connected humanly to, through my bloodline. Yeah, that's why I just get so, I don't want to get too far off the trail, but that's why I wonder what the net effect will be of some of these like surrogate mother things, and where you're bringing children into the world where you're intentionally cutting ties to their lineage. You're intentionally cutting ties to the heritage that comes from the Lord, and I just wonder what that will do later on in life as they grow up.
The beauty of, I guess, the Christian faith, right, is you can be then adopted into a larger eternal family that overrides all the earth.
That can override all of that.
Right, and then feel, okay, I'm connected and part of something.
Part of
Even
something.
if I can't figure out what that is on
Yeah.
earth, right?
That kind of makes me realize that even, because there are people that aren't able to have children, right? So where does that leave them, right? So, but like Paul, the Apostle Paul talks about Timothy as his son, like so there are spiritual children that are, not a fruit of a physical womb, but the labor of love, that relationship, that being the spiritual mother, being the spiritual father, you have an opportunity to have spiritual children that is just as eternal, right? So we can't lose sight of that.
Yeah, can't lose sight of that at all. So we had a funeral here a few weeks back, and John Hack, and he was very much a spiritual father to me. So you have that dynamic that goes on within the church, that connectedness that transcends human bonds, right? And it's now a divine sort of thing, and that's the family God. That's what God is building. That's what He's calling us into. And as parents, that is our primary role, right? And so the point of what I'm saying there is the goal of parenting has eternal dimensions to it, and we need to be careful not to get caught up in the day-to-day struggles of it and the moment-by-moment of it and lose sight of what the big picture is. And that's the big picture. The heritage is the bloodline of Jesus Christ. And then in verse 4 he says, like arrows in the hand of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth. Happy is the man who has a quiver full of them. They shall not be ashamed, but shall speak with their enemies in the gate. What do you make of that? The children are like arrows. Besides, you can get hurt by them.
Well, arrows are sent out,
Arrows are meant to be shot.
and they're meant to be. You don't keep them. They do
Right.
no good if you just keep them with you.
Yeah.
Like their purpose is void.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like that's right. Like that's what you're talking about, being in this like sort of bubble. I guess like trying to shelter your kids, but like at some point you have they will go.
Yeah.
They will go,
And so
whether you want them to or
right.
not.
And you want
Or they should go.
they should go.
They should go, whether they want to or not.
Yeah. I just think like there's someone said to me once we borrow our children.
Yeah, no, I
Like,
think that,
and I
I've
think
heard that before.
When you tie it back into like the heritage, like it says a heritage from the Lord, meaning that like it's not just me, like they're from the Lord, and so they can go like they could they should go back.
Yeah, no, I think that's it exactly. The arrow is meant to be shot out, right? It's not designed to sit in the quiver forever, right? And if you kind of press into a little bit more about kind of the imagery behind that, arrows in those days were handmade, right? They had to be shaped, and the more time a warrior would spend on making sure his arrows were built correctly, the better able he was to hit whatever target he was shooting at, because it would fly true, right? And so I think it does bring in both of those aspects, that they are meant to be sent out, and while they're in your care, God is using you as a parent to shape them to be launched into the
To
world.
fly straight.
To fly straight.
Yeah.
And that ties back again to the earlier conversation, that if your parenting has that clear eternal dimension, then what you're shaping them for is to be sent out by God, to do whatever the Lord has for them in their lives. You really do return them to the Lord, which is, they're adults now, they're in your hands, kind of a thing. But what about verse 5? What do you make of that? Happy is the man whose quiver is full of them, which means more the merrier, I guess, but it depends on the size of your quiver. Some of us have smaller quivers than others, but so it's a good thing. Children are good things, I think that. But what about that last phrase there? They shall not be ashamed, but shall speak with their enemies, or the other, that word speak is a little bit difficult to translate. It could mean when they contest with their enemies at the gate. What do you think he's getting at there about having this quiver full of arrows that are sent out, and you as a parent then being able to contest with your enemy in the gate? Again, this is poetry, so it's kind of a lot of imagery, there's a feel to it.
Is it talking about meaning that they shall not be ashamed, like your children should not be ashamed of the gospel that maybe hopefully you instilled in them, and contesting their enemies at the gate, maybe like standing up for truth against the enemy?
Right, so that brings up a good question. Who's the they? Is it the parent or is it the child?
Well, if it was the parent, it wouldn't say they, would it? It
Yeah,
would say
man,
he
like
or
man.
she, or
But-
singular, or
Well, I think happy is the man, so maybe they would just refer to like multiple.
Yeah, I think the typical understanding is that they refers to parents,
oh really?
because the whole thing is talking about the parent, the
Mm.
parent, the parent, the parent.
Mm.
So like the man should not be ashamed of the arrow that's in.
Should not be ashamed of the arrow, but instead, that arrow should provide him additional strength. When they talk about a gate, what is the gate?
Protection.
Yeah, it's the entryway into the city or into the community. It's the entry. It's where the enemy is guarded, or the enemy is kept out, right? And so, as he's talking about being able to speak or contest the enemy, the idea is defensive, right? And so, if the more children you have, or the more children a community has, that are straight arrows, that are sent out, that are on the mission, the more protection there is for the larger community. Right? It provides protection for you as parents, for your home, for your family, and in a larger context for the church. Right? Because that's how God is building his kingdom. He's building it not just through new converts that we meet in the world, but through birth and children being led to the Lord.
It's funny, it's very similar to, I don't know if Judaism is the right word, but I was watching a documentary on Hasidic Jews in New York City, and the one guy was interviewing the gentleman, and a point kept coming up a lot. Like, he kept saying, so you're not trying to convert anybody? The guy kept saying, no, we're not trying to convert anybody. So he was like, so how does this work then? Like, and he was like, the more kids we have, the more kids we have on our religion. Is exactly what his answer was.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's true. It's certainly true in Islam. I forget I know in Europe, I saw some statistic that the average European Caucasian couple has even less children in the U.S., which is like 1.5 or whatever the number is. Yeah, 1.5 kids. Yeah, that half a kid. Yeah, he's not all that. He's not all that. But the average Muslim family has like 8. Project that out, and they're saying by the year 2040, 2050, I forget the numbers, but something like that, it will be predominantly Muslim, and that's what it is. And the Hasidic community is the same way. In a sense, that is one of the things in here is children are good. It is a good thing to have a quiver full of them. Not a good thing for your sanity when they're all under 2, but it is. They are gifts from God, and they roll into the future. They are the future, right? So anyway, that's a little bit of a side, but out of Psalm 127, and there's a lot of different ways to go about this, the mission as parents is to disciple your children and send them out. That's the mission. And when I say disciple them, that is to lead them to the Lord and then train them up in the ways of the Lord. Right? There's plenty of scriptures on that. So that's not hard to conceive, but that is the mission. And that is, when things are flying apart, the thing you need to keep in mind. There's a big picture, and God has the big picture, and we need to keep the big picture. And the second piece of that is, or the second piece I want to kind of frame tonight, so that's the mission. That's no matter where you are, that's where you're going. But the way your priorities are shaped also depend on where you are. What season in life are you in as a family? Are you in with your children? Because it varies greatly from a 2-year-old to a 13-year-old to a 30-year-old. Very, very different. But the mission is never changing. And so I just touch on it real briefly. That's Ecclesiastes 3. I skipped the center section. It's a very, very famous, there's a time for every season. There's a time to be born, there's a time to die, and it goes on. It's just a beautiful, beautiful song in there. But it begins with, to everything there is a season, a time and purpose, a time for every purpose under heaven. And then the bracket at the other end of that song is, He has made everything beautiful in its time. He has put eternity in their hearts. Except no one can find out what God does from the beginning to the end. And so you need to know your season. Where are you now in life in reference to the mission that God has given you as parents? And so the season may vary in terms of the particulars, but it should not vary in terms of what you're aiming at. It's always aimed at the same thing.
So your season could be time to cry.
Yes. Who's
And
in
then-
that season,
And
right?
then there'll be a time to laugh.
No.
I cry a lot, so I think I'm always in the season of crying.
Jill, that's because we're Italian.
Or yelling.
Very in touch with your emotions.
Yelling or crying?
Eating, yelling, crying,
Laughing.
laughing,
All of
In a
it.
5 minutes time frame.
laughing till I'm crying.
So know the mission. It's to make disciples of your children and send them out. Because it is temporary. It does go very, very quickly. And when you think about some of the particulars that you shared about where you'd like to see your family in 20 years, a lot of it was about relationship. That starts now. That doesn't just magically come out of thin air in 20 years from now. It needs to be taught and modeled now where you are. And so there's a lot of different ways to break down the season. I just did it. Anyone familiar with the classical learning model? It's like there's 3 phases of it. Homeschoolers usually know.
I've heard of the word being thrown around.
Yeah, I heard the word. I know it's there somewhere. Yeah, classical learning basically says there's 3 main stages. There's 3 main stages of learning: the grammar stage, the dialectic stage, and the rhetoric stage. And simply put, the grammar stage is where you are teaching. That's the first step in learning, where you're just giving the basic information. So if you think about a child under 6, you're teaching them the alphabet. You know, what are the letters? How to identify them? What are the sounds? And maybe they can start putting them together. You know, cat, dog, start forming some words. That's the grammar stage, giving the basic facts about whatever topic we're talking about. And here we're talking about discipleship, giving them the basic facts, because that's really all they can grasp. From 0 to 6, that's really the most you can do is start doing things like alphabets and stuff like that. The dialectic stage is now they can begin to put this stuff together. So if you think of it in terms of the alphabet, now they can begin to form words, then they can begin to put the words together in sentences, and then in paragraphs, and then in larger things, they start to learn grammar, what these words are. It's a verb, it's a noun, it's an adverb, how it all fits together. And they're beginning to understand why this is important, how it all fits together. And they're beginning to build their knowledge of the way something works. And then the third stage, or the final stage in the classical learning model, is after you've got the basic facts down and you're beginning to understand how to put it all together, the next step is now it begins to come out of you. You begin to use the tools that you have been taught. And so rhetoric talks about speech. So if you think in terms of words, now I know how to spell, I know grammar, I know basic sentence structure, I know how to build essays. Now I can communicate my own ideas. And that's the rhetoric stage. And so if you think of it in terms of sending, that's what you're doing. You're equipping them along the way in the different phases of life in order for them to begin to use it as they are sent out into the world, to begin to use all of those tools. And it's not, I was using language as kind of the example there because that's kind of the classical learning model. But I think God uses the same basic form because it's how our minds are wired. And so if you look at Scripture, you'll see three words that are repeated very often. You'll see this as we look at Proverbs, actually. It's knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. Knowledge, that's the grammar, that's the basic facts. Understanding is how they go together. How do these things fit together? What does it mean? And then wisdom is the art of using those tools that you're learning. And you move along that based on maturity, based on your ability to do these things. And so when we talk about children, for example, 0 to 6, it's really all they can do is be taught basic facts. That's hot, you don't touch hot. That's cold, that's okay. And, whatever else, there's a million different things you can
So
do.
when we were we homeschooled our kids too. So when we were teaching them, when he did the Bible teaching, and he would ask a question, it was Jesus. Everything was Jesus.
Jesus, God,
Jesus.
love. They got that down pretty
That's
quickly.
a fact. That's a knowledge.
And that's a good thing. That's what you want to avoid is trying to push them past what they can go. And so understanding which category, for example, and again, there's nothing magic about this. It's just to use tonight to kind of talk about things. But which categories do you drop? If you're under 2, you're definitely in the early grammar stage, right? And you're trying to get them to just articulate a thought, right?
Anything I can understand.
Yeah, anything
Yeah.
besides a scream.
Yeah.
It's yeah. So it's grammar, which is knowledge, dialectic stage, which is really beginning to connect these things up in some kind of understanding, and then wisdom is it starts to come back out of them, and they begin to learn the tools so that in the last stage, they're ready to go into the world. They're equipped, so when they're dealing with the craziness that's out there, they have the tools to deal with it and know how to use them. And they know how to use them independently of you as a parent telling them, no, do this, do that. And so underneath that, I have, it begins with carry, right? So you think about your newborn, you literally have to carry them. And then it goes from carrying to hand holding. If you look at a 5, 6, 7-year-old and you're out in a crowded store, you have them by the hand. You're not letting them go. And so you're leading them by literally holding their hand. And from 6 to 12, you can begin to let go of that hand because they're going to stay with you. And you can actually lead them and they will follow you. And then when you get into those teen years, so that's what you're experiencing, I think, is they begin to push away from you. They don't want to be led anymore. You want now to begin to transition to side by side. That they're not looking for you to be in front of them all the time, but they're comfortable with you being alongside. And I think you mentioned about when you think 20 years, you want to have good communication with your children. That's where you want to be, side by side with them, so that they actually want to have a relationship with you. They don't want to maintain that you're the parent, I'm the child, because they're not there anymore. But you want to build into them a comfort and a safety and a desire to still want to maintain a relationship and come to you for advice and counsel. And we see this with our kids now. It's just been one of the blessings through all of the chaos. It's like, wow, they still actually like us, and they do.
Well, my parents had 5 children, and we all talk all the time.
That's
Yeah.
fantastic.
My mom and my dad were alive. Just to call them for silly stuff and for very serious stuff, of course. But how much salt do I need in this? Okay, fine. And we assured that they were always on the other side. My brother called me just say silly things, but I know he was.
Yeah, he just wants to talk, and that's fantastic. Now,
Yeah.
I'm guessing there's quite a distance between you, though,
Yes.
geographically.
Yeah, in age too.
In age, oh,
Yeah,
okay.
I'm that fifth.
Yeah.
And the closest one in age is 6 years old.
Oh,
to
okay.
me, so,
Yeah, so there's a
but
bit of a spread.
it's a fantastic relationship. I think.
Yeah.
They're very close.
And so when you think, I think a number of, you mentioned, when you think 20 years down, you want your kids to have good relationship with each other. I think one of the best ways to ensure it or to help it along is that they each have a good relationship with you, because they may not actually like one another all that much, but they will come together around you as the central. I don't think you want to stay there forever, but if you have a good relationship with all of your children, it continues to provide a context as adults for them to begin to work out some of the things that you're seeing now between them in this sibling rivalry thing, which is pretty normal within a family. I was always amazed at the question, look through Scripture and find me a good example of siblings.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Joseph and his, no.
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 Well, the other brothers got along, right? Yeah, let's
They
throw
all
him in a
agreed.
well. Yeah, they all
Let's get
agree.
rid of Joseph.
Yeah, throw him down a well. Yeah. So it's pretty normal for children to grow up at odds with one another. There's a lot of there's a lot of reasons behind that. But if, as a parent, the home environment is safe for all of them, and they really do want that relationship, they will stay, and they'll begin, because that's what we're seeing in our family is our children are beginning to work out some of their differences because they still have a context in which to work it out, with us sort of at the center of it.
I guess that kind of makes me think, like, as Christians, we fight with one another, don't we? Like all these different denominations and all these different ways of doing things, and we have sibling rivalry amongst the Christian brothers and sisters, but we're all connected to Christ. We're all connected to God, and that keeps us from like killing each other.
Well, should
You should anyway, right?
All right, so we only have about 15 minutes or so. So what I wanted to do, I was hoping to be able to walk through, at least touch on each of the categories, just get some ideas of, well, what does it mean? What are some of the things in the hand-holding phase, for example, that you should be focusing on? But I wanted to share some of what we've learned looking back from where we are now. Like, what are the big picture things that it doesn't matter which phase you're in, that these always apply? Now, we talked about the faith aspect. That's probably number one. That always applies. It'll look different how you're teaching them and what you're teaching them, but it always applies. But looking back, what would you say some of the biggest things that are always true?
So, and you probably are all doing this as well, but looking back in my parenting, well, you're familiar with the James passage, if any man lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally. So we all lack wisdom, right? So that was like my daily prayer. Lord, I don't know what to do here. I don't know what to do here. And so asking him for wisdom. And that takes humility to recognize that you don't know what you're doing. And to go to the one who is able to help you. So I just think humility, and I struggled with that. I grew up in a family where, it's like pride and like you should be able to know what you're doing. So anyway, that was a constant battle, but God kept humbling me, and I could see looking back that was key, and just going to him for help all the time. But along with that, Psalm 53 verses 1 and 2 have really recently come to mind. The one says, the fool says in his heart, there's no God. They're corrupt and they do vile deeds. There's no one who does good. But verse 2 says, God looks down from heaven on the human race to see if there's anyone who is wise. Like, we all want to be wise, right? So then he describes one who seeks God. So the fool is one that says, there's no God. I don't need him. I got this. I'm good. But one who is wise seeks God. Not the wisdom, but him. I think there's a difference between seeking wisdom, which is what James verse is talking about, which is good. We need to seek wisdom. But greater than that is to seek the source of that wisdom, seek God. And so whatever situation you're in, whatever phase you're in, whatever struggle you're going through, is just turn to God all the time. And not only turning to God in prayer, but turning to God in his word. so that you get to know the God that you're turning to. So I made a lot of mistakes in parenting. Believe me, my kids will tell you.
Yes,
They
they
will-
have them written
They
down.
will,
Things.
they will go down the line of all the mistakes that we've made, and we've made plenty. But by God's grace, the one thing that they will tell you that both of us, this is when I start crying, is that they saw a change. They saw a change in me. They saw that I was like this, but with the humility and the seeking the wisdom and seeking Him, I opened myself up for God to change me, transform me, from being proud to being humble, from being like so tightly wound and anxious to being more like, all right, chill out, chill out. And so when they see that change and they know it wasn't like me saying, okay, I'm going to be a better person now. It was me humbling myself under the mighty hand of God and asking Him to help me. And they see that and they know that it was from Him. That speaks volumes to them. That speaks more powerfully to them than any answers that I can give them, like scripture verses that I could quote them and all of that. For them to see the power of God changing me from who they saw that I was like to who they see me now is powerful. So all that to say is, don't focus so much on what to do in the parenting, but focus on your own relationship with the Lord.
That's huge. Within the last year, I feel like Denise and I have experienced something similar because it's like, being a perfect parent is a pipe dream.
Mm-hmm.
But like, my faults as a dad are like just like very glaringly evident. My kids know what dad needs to work on. Right? So it's like when we have bedtime prayers and we pray for each other, and then you hear like the kids like, praying for dad. That's like
That's
very
powerful.
very touching.
Yeah.
Like, and that wasn't something that was provoked. I remember the first time. What's up?
Pray that Daddy doesn't beat us anymore.
It's like I pray that you'll help dad with his anger, right? And I lash out in anger, and I scream and I say things that I shouldn't. So then another time was when I think it was Dominic or Joseph, but they were like, Dad, you've been doing a really good job not yelling. And I was like, thanks, bud. But what I've tried to show them is grace in my own life.
Right.
Like, show them that I am not perfect. Don't be like me. Be like Jesus. And the way that they see that Christianity is real, the way that they see like Jesus is real, is when they see people change.
Yes.
Right? And it's not always about us trying to mold them to be perfect, because that's never going to happen. But when you can really show them like real change in your life, they're like, okay.
Yeah.
And
they
never
they
like,
know themselves. They know that they're not perfect. They're not good. So when they see, if God can do that for you, God can do that for me.
100%.
Right?
I wrote something down. I was listening to a podcast. I hope I can find this. All right, I'll come back to it. I wrote it down. It was about parenting, and it was just such a good quote. I'll find it.
Well, when you got to just shout out, but I think bottom line in that simple category, example. Be the example to your kids. And so you struggle with consistency. I don't know a parent who doesn't, right? We are inconsistent, and then we blow up, right? We let it go. Now I've had it, right? Opportunity to model the gospel. Ask their forgiveness, confess it, ask their forgiveness, and see. And now they're seeing the gospel in flesh, right? They're seeing it being lived out in front of them because it's real. When my wife, they have these conversations now, which I think are great about, they do remind us of our failures. And then, we can apologize for it.
Yeah.
And we can say, yeah, we messed up. And there's forgiveness there, and there's healing. That's powerful because they're seeing it in real life, not just in a lecture. That's kind of the rhetoric stage. It's coming out, right? And they're beginning to see it kind of being worked in. So I think be the example. Even a bad example. You got it?
Yeah, I got it. It said, most of parenting is not necessarily how we are shaping our kids, but instead how God, the good parent, is shaping us.
Yeah. And I would say us is all of us, including the kids. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's cool.
I was just gonna say, it's funny that you brought that up, because when you originally brought up the point, okay, think of where we're at now, where we want to get to, and how do we bridge that gap, the one thought that came to my mind was wisdom. You know, we have to be wise and not perfect, because you're not going to make the right decision every single time. But we have to be wise in our parenting and how we're shepherding our kids, right? Well, okay, so how do we obtain that wisdom, right? It's not necessarily striving for the what to do,
Right.
but we obtain that wisdom by going to God and seeking Him.
Yep.
Right.
And living it.
It falls into place.
And living it in your own life, because we should be seeking that wisdom for our lives in general, not just as parents, but as spouses, as co-workers, as whatever. We should be seeking God's wisdom to navigate the world, and let your kids see that. Let them see the struggles, let them see the failures, and own them and admit them, admit it to them, and that will do more than all of the lessons, the formal lessons that you do. So I think being a clear example is huge. I would say the next one is one of the best things you can do for your children is give them a strong marriage. Let them see that the marriage comes first, because it does. The marriage is for a lifetime. Your parenting, we talked earlier, it goes like that. And one of the statistics, I don't know if it's still true, but going back about 10 years, one of the statistics that I found pretty surprising was the spike in divorce is around 19 or 20 years into the marriage, which is when the kids disappear, because suddenly the couple looks at each other and it's like, who are you? I don't even like you anymore. They've lost the common ground, right? What your kids need to see that this relationship is primary, and they want that. They want that for themselves, because this is the relationship that models Christ. And it models, so they should see that confession and repentance taking place in here. They should see the unconditional love taking place here. They should see that openly. Our kids, even today, they kind of roll their eyes when I show signs of affection toward my bride, which I love to do to them. But they still.
Literally said to me last night, she's like, it makes me uncomfortable when you and Dad kiss. She's 7, and I was like,
We'll stay
"Good,
uncomfortable."
It means that we love each other.
Yes,
So
it is a
we'd rather
good.
fight, because we do that too sometimes.
Yeah.
I see that as well.
And they should see the makeup
They see
after.
it all.
Yeah, they should see it all, because that's real life. So a clear example: a strong marriage and tying strings. Why don't you do the tying strings piece?
So tying strings is the idea of if like he and I are in a relationship. Every time we do something together that we honor one another, we're just having fun together, a string is tied. But let's say, translate it to your children. If you do something that they're just having a great time, they're making memories, you're making memories, those are all strings. Just picture thousands of strings being tied. You're having a good time encouraging them, praising them, or even disciplining them, but in a loving way. You're tying strings so that when the tough times come, especially in the teen years, and they're starting to pull away, and hormones are just raging, like things are happening that you just can't control. Friends come into the picture, the world influence comes into the picture. Strings are being cut. You're going to say something, they're going to say something, you're going to do something, and those strings are being cut. But if you've tied 1,000 strings, you can have 100 strings cut and it'll withstand. And then you're tying more strings, new strings. So I guess the idea is to just keep tying strings with each other, with whoever you're in relationship with, husband, wife, parent, child, because those strings will be cut. That's a given. But if you have enough strings tied, the relationship will survive it.
Yeah, it's just a way of, for me, visualizing the relationship is the most important thing. When you're parenting your children, a lot of times we can get so caught up in behavior and performance and obedience and just doing things right that the relationship suffers. That we're actually cutting strings unnecessarily when we should be looking to build strings. Or tie strings. We should be looking to build the relationship, taking every possible opportunity to do that, because the world will force the things to be cut. And if you don't have a strong relationship going into the teen years, and a lot of strings get cut, that's when they disappear. They just went out.
But it's okay that strings are being cut.
It's,
in
yeah,
that
it
state.
will happen.
It's okay.
It will happen.
Just look for those opportunities to tie new strings and know that there will come a time to tie new strings. For example, my son and I, we butted heads
Oh, yeah.
a lot. I mean,
They're basically the same person, just
yeah, we're
different
very
gender.
much alike. So we were like two alphas, just like going at it. And there were a lot of strings tied when they were little, teen, a lot of strings cut, but it survived. There were enough strings that it just survived. And now it's back in my house. And we're the fact that he wanted to come back is so like, wow. But going back to when he was a teenager, as soon as he got his license, driver's license, and got his own car, he named it Freedom. I'm out of here.
Yep.
I mean, they have to go through that. They have to figure out, what does it look like, life out from under mom and dad? But he came back.
Yeah, it came back,
Yeah.
and the amazing piece is, for me, in that particular relationship, is not only, so he was down in North Carolina, he got transferred up to Earl, so he moved back up in March with his wife and two very large dogs, and they came to our house while they were looking for a house. But if you paid attention at all to the housing market, yeah, that's not happening. We're all perfectly content being there, to the point now that we're actually in conversation about, well, maybe what we can do is sell this place because it's a small house and get something together that's like a mother-daughter or whatever, that's more workable, because that's what he and his wife,
Yeah.
they want that relation, and they're thinking about starting a family, and they want us in their children's lives. And that, if you had asked me at 18 what the likelihood of this was, it's like,
So,
yeah, it ain't
like,
happening.
in the moment when you're struggling, you have to zoom out. You have to zoom out. Don't get hung up in the nitty-gritty of the detail of the moment. Zoom out. And first of all, know that God's got you. God's got them. And God is all about bringing people together. So trust Him. So I want to read you a quote sort of similar to it. It was a podcast that I was listening to. And this is an amazing story. It's 8 o'clock, so I'll try and say it quickly. This young woman grew up in a Christian home, very similar to our situation, somehow got all messed up in her head, and she wanted to transition to being a man. Went through the whole transition, for 10 years lived as a man, and then by God's grace came to know the Lord, and now detransitioned, now a woman serving in church ministry. But she said that during that whole stage where she was like watching her parents, so how, watching her parents, their reaction to the whole thing. And she says that her mom is telling this story. She said she heard God say to her, the mom, only one of us, God speaking, only one of us is going to work on her, the one that transitioned. If you want to work on her, I'll go sit down. God is saying, if you want to work on her, I'll go sit down. But if you want me to work on her, you go sit down. And you get in the Word and work on your relationship with me, and I will work on her. And she just goes on to say, like, she just saw the mom change, that change. And that's what led her to change. It's powerful. So don't worry about the tough times. Zoom out and know that God's got you.
Keep the big picture in mind at all times. So you look at so we didn't get time to do this, so well. But when that ends at 8:30, yeah, I don't know what happens now.
They told us 8 o'clock, so.
So I don't know where you need to be, but if you need to leave, you can leave.
We wander around for 25 minutes, pretty much, so.
Oh, okay.
We can go a little longer.
Okay.
All right, let me just run quickly through what the three phases are, and then maybe we can talk. And again, if you want to go, you can go. So from 0 to 6, one of the things that I remember hearing when our kids were in that age group was, children are like concrete. And by the time they're 6, it's hardened. And what he was talking about was their basic character. So your children are born with certain bents. They might be strong-willed, they might be rebellious, they might be overly compliant. They have a natural bent to them. But before the age of 6, and there's no magic to that number, roughly in that state, before that, you can do things to shape that in the way it's going to go, in the way that's going to be lived out. But by the time they get to be around 6, that concrete has hardened. And to make changes at that character level like that becomes much, much more difficult. And so if you have kids in that early childhood age, look at the bent of their character and ask yourself, what can I do to train it? So let's say they're, should have come up with an example before. Let's say that they're just a strong-willed child. That's a negative. That can be a negative thing, meaning that they're going to be constantly at odds with everyone around them. But having a strong will could also mean commitment. Could also mean perseverance. Could also mean. So how do you take it and bend it into those kinds of things? What can you do for them intentionally to bend them that way? Whatever, and you have to just know your kid. What is it in their character that is clearly, okay, this is going to be an issue?
Yeah.
Because before 6, you can really make changes and make it intentional. You can even make it fun. You can put them through training things about.
I'm serious. Well, we've actually, like, with Jonah specifically, he's like just angry, like, which he was sort of predisposed to that just from, if you want to talk like heritage-wise, ethnicity-wise, he was just gonna be in the negative from the get-go. But I'm reading this book called Habits of the Household. I can't remember the author's name right now, but he does this like catechism type thing with his kids, where he says like, "Can you see my eyes?" Like to kind of draw their attention to this like singular moment, and he says, "Do you know that I love you? No matter the good things you do. Do you know I love you no matter the bad things you do?" And that the child answers yes, and then you ask the child, "Well, who else loves you like that?" And the answer is God. And so even though Jonah's only 2, we've been starting to just say
That's
this,
good.
and right now they're just words to him.
That's the grammar.
Potentially they're just words to him, but at some point when he says it back to me or says it back to Rob, he's going to recognize that, even though Jonah, I was so mad today that I pushed my brother, or that I threw my toys, or I busted a hole in the wall, whatever it may be, because I was so mad, I just punched the wall. He'll remember that even though those are bad things, God loves him, and we love him, and hopefully that concrete will set into that, like, okay, I might be passionate, and how do I kind of harness that
I think that's right.
Positive, positive outcome, as opposed to like, I'm not going to just go slamming things around, but I can be passionate about something and persevere through to like the end goal.
Right. And I think that's kind of a good way of viewing the two sides, right? Anger is the negative. Passion for science, that's a good thing, right? So what sort of things, so the question you and Rob should be running through together is, okay, what sort of things can we do with him that allows him to express passion in a positive way, and just work on those. And the catechism is great because that's the grammar. You're giving him building blocks. And even though you think, oh, he doesn't know, they're just words, maybe not. But as he grows older, he's going to begin to be able to connect the things that are already in there as he gets in the dialectic phase. And so grammar phase, concrete is setting up. You do have a limited time. And by the time that, and those with older children, you probably see this already, that things they exhibited when they were small, it's like rock solid now. And it's really difficult to make change.
What do you do then?
Now it's, well, that's, you pray, because God can change the concrete. But I think, so when they go into the next stage, it's just kind of carry the concrete thing. When and they're pouring sidewalks in our neighborhood now, so I've been watching this happen. It sets up very quickly, and it's hard. It's beginning, but they can still work the surface. It's called floating. They can float the surface. They can still shape the outer pieces of it so that, even though underneath it may be hard, you can still work with it. But you're limited as to how much change you can do. And so when you think about that 6 to 12, that's when they're beginning to outward face in the world. I'm not a big proponent of under 6 handing my child to someone else, whether that's childcare, whether that's daycare, whatever it is. I think it's a dangerous thing because of how malleable they are in that phase, and they're with someone who knows what they're being shaped by, what environment. So anyway, that's just a personal, people have to do what they have to do, but just know that that's happening. By the time they reach 6, now it's time to begin to expose them to the world around them and work on those surface things, how they interact with people, how they interact with not just kids their own age. I think that's one of the problems with the way our school systems are structured. No offense, Pete, but is that
Like it's all your fault.
No, I didn't structure the school, so don't.
Yeah. But we tend to put our kids in very narrow social structures. Everyone looks like me, dresses like me, is within 6 months of my age, come from the same ethnic or not socioeconomic background, and we wonder why they form these incredible cliques because they're just like glued to each other. You need to know that that's happening, whatever school system you're going to choose, and that's a whole other topic. But you need to know that force is happening. That's pressing them into a mold to only want to be around people that they can really relate to, and expose them to generational changes, expose them to people who are very different than they are, so they learn to interact with people of all different backgrounds, all different, and you can do that, holding their hand, walking them through that in that age. And then by the time they get to the teen, it's time to let go and begin to let them do things that scare the tar out of you. But it's time. It's time to let them be out of the house without you there. They're going to be driving at 16. It's time to teach them how to drive and let them go. It's time, unfortunately, to hand them a phone. And when they're 6 to 12, teach them what the internet is about. Be on it with them so that they can see how to use it well, how to do research on it and things like that, and where the dangers are. So by the time they have their own device, they're at least aware of that, right? And so in that 12 to 18, that's when you're putting to use all of the stuff that you've been teaching them, and you let them go, and that's where the prayer really starts, I think, is in those teen years, because you do have to let go. The idea is to send them out. And then when they get to be 18, you have decisions about college. I would caution you on just being pressed into the mold of our culture, which says they need to go to a college, and they need to go to a college that's got a big name, and they need to go to a college that's across the country. Because if you want your children to grow up as adults and be somewhere else, send them to school in a different state. They will probably stay there. That's going to be a result of it. And not saying it's a bad thing necessarily to get an education like that, but it's not for everyone. So our kids are all around, and even though it was really not an intentional choice, they all went to school in New Jersey, and they all stayed in New Jersey. This is where they grew up. This is what their home is, and they're successful in life. So I don't know. So think carefully when you get to 18. What are you sending them into? And just don't fall into what the culture is saying you ought to do next, which is send them to an expensive school somewhere else that they're not coming back from.
Yeah.
Or when they come back, they're going to be radically different.
So I think the main point out of that is don't let the world determine what you do. Be in the Word, seek God, be one that is wise, one who seeks God, and let Him guide you and respond to Him.
So I know I kind of crammed in that last piece, and I apologize for that. But any questions on like where you are in your particular phase with your kids? Questions about kind of, well, what does it mean now? I have a child in that 6 to 12, and here's what it is. So any questions or specifics?
So would you say that the teenager kids are the hardest part of any parenting? Or where was that?
It's a different kind of hard, but it is very, very hard.
You're scaring me.
Well,
No, you're supposed to say no.
No, it gets easier from here.
The hardest part, and I'm on the outside looking in right now, but it's probably knowing when to. Obviously, you have to let your kids fail, and you have to let them experience failure and bad choices. So it's like having wisdom on knowing when right to swoop in and save them and protect them, and when to just say, you're making that decision, now you gotta experience the consequences.
Right.
Yeah, and that is part of the sending, because that's what you're preparing them for, to live with their own consequences. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
But I think to answer your question, I would distinguish between hard and frightening. Because what I found with our kids as teenagers, it's just frightening. Because you are following God's design in preparing and sending, but you're sending them into a world that has lost its mind. And that's just scary. You know, when they're out at night, yeah, you just think, well, where are they? Or they're coming back and they're arguing with you. It's like, where did you get that idea from? Right? And you're beginning to battle the influence of the world on them. And so each stage is hard for different reasons, but I think in terms of frightening, the teenage years are frightening.
But it is frightening, 100%. But we don't want to live in fear. We don't want to we don't want our kids to see you living in fear, right? God says, "Fear not. Don't be anxious. Don't worry about tomorrow." So the way we counteract that temptation to be afraid is to go to the one who has promised to work all things, even my mistakes, even my inability, just all that's messed up about me. He promises to work that for the good of conforming me to Christ. And if I could show my kids that process of being conformed to Christ, that's, what else can I give them? You know? So.
And I guess, okay.
And then, like I said, like you said, sorry, I don't know your name. Pete. Yeah. So, like Pete was saying, you know, it's like, as an outsider, right? The only reference I have is that when I was a teenager, what did I want, right? So I'm thinking, like, you know, I heard it said before, like, no matter what your kids are doing at that age, is that they gotta know that you're there for them. So if your phone is ringing at 12 o'clock in the morning and saying, hey, listen, pick me up, go pick them up.
Right.
You gotta be, I guess, there for them.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
And for them to be able to feel comfortable to say, because whatever's happening, that they're comfortable enough to call you, or safe, they feel safe enough to call you, yeah, that's where you want to be.
Yeah. We have good friends who, he told us a story similar to that. When he was a teenager, his dad said, no matter when, no matter what, if you need me to pick you up, call me, I will pick you up, no questions asked. I will not ask you what you were doing, you know, and that safety enabled him to actually take him up on it. And, you know, so that's good.
Yeah, and another piece on it, because there's a similar kind of story to that. Another, you know, we talk about what is God building? He's building the church. And raising your children within the community of the church is hugely important. I saw a statistic going back a couple of years that said the likelihood of a child, as they transition into adulthood, of walking away from the faith is directly tied to how many adult friends they had in the church growing up. And so, in other words, if you're within the church and you have a community of friends that you're all kind of in the same stage of life, if your children are able to make friendships there with them, it increases the likelihood that they're going to stay in the faith. And one of the examples that I would give is a very similar story, and I think it was our son told us this. So we have a number of really close friends that we've been at the church for 40 years or whatever it is, that our kids grew up together. And two of them pulled my son aside and said, you get one phone call. If you're in trouble, you call, we'll come get you wherever you are, no questions asked, and we'll drop you off at home. You get one card. And that stuck with him. It was like, you get one card each, and you play it once. And just the thought of having someone else in the church that had their back, that cared enough for them to give them the safety of saying, oh, and they added to, and we won't tell your father. That was the other piece of it, and we won't tell your father.
It's funny, Dave said the same thing to me just the other week. So.
That sounds like a deal.
Yeah, that is it. I'm not going to name any names,
Yeah,
but yeah. Not going to name any names. So I think that's a big part of it as well. In the community, and let them build friendships within it. Because my son has his two closest friends are the two he grew up with right here. And Yeah, there's still a very tight network of kids, and they've been through stuff. They've been through stuff. Anything else? We're already 20 after. You're gonna miss the ice cream or whatever comes last.
If you don't mind, I'll share. There's a really good podcast that Dan Terciano shared with me that I've kind of shared with the TD guys. It's called the Family Discipleship Podcast. It had the guy that I think his name was Justin Early, right? Justin Whitley Early or whatever. He was on there. Yeah.
Justin Early Whitley.
Yeah.
That might be his name.
But just different topics. Each podcast is like 30, 40 minutes, and they're just super, super solid. So I would definitely recommend that. And then Denise and I read a book, I probably should reread it, called Shepherding Your Child's Heart. That was a pretty solid read too.
Yeah.
Like you said, it was getting away from like behavioral management and like being orderly and just focusing on like the heart. Obviously,
The
child's
relationship,
heart, but
yeah.
focusing on the relationship
Yeah.
less than the expectation of like order in the household.
Yeah, because that's what's gonna last.
Right.
Relationship, and there's lots of resources for the smaller kids down the hallway here. You can certainly talk to Linda. She's got a lot of good resources for that, and we're here. You can pick our brains all you like.
You can always learn from our mistakes.
Yes. Yes. Anything else? Okay, let me just pray for us, and then you can go find your children. Lord, we thank you for giving us this time together tonight and talk about just a really incredibly important topic of training up our children. And Lord, so I pray that we would just keep sight of what's important, what the mission is. That's to disciple them and to send them into the world, trusting you to care for them. So I just pray for each one here and the families represented, that you would just bless their parenting, bless their marriages, bless their homes, that they would just be well-grounded in the wisdom that you provide, and that they would really live their faith out before their children so that they can see that alive in their parents and seek to model it. So we just commit the families here tonight to you, and thank you again for our time together. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Amen.